taken by a former student of mine when he was working at a cholera outbreak in Zimbabwe. And so in this particular case, the emergency cholera hospital was set up pretty quickly in a small facility. I can't remember what it was, maybe a library that was repurposed or something, something that wasn't supposed to be a cholera hospital. And so the setup is pretty straightforward. The room is lined with cots, as you can see here, and each cot is lined with a clean plastic mat. And in the center of the plastic mat is a hole where your butt would go, and then a bucket underneath. And so the patient would lie here, obviously be covered, for some level of privacy, as much privacy as you can get in a circumstance like that. And then the individual just has diarrhea in this bucket, because this person, if somebody's lying here, can't get up and be brought to a latrine. They have to just go right here because they're excreting so much so frequently. The room would be a mess. And so the typical rule is you collect what's in the bucket and then measure, and the buckets are clear with graduation, so you can measure volume. And then whatever amount of fluid that is lost has to be replaced back into that individual. And these are color coded so that you know which ones have been used and which ones are ready to go. So when the patient first walks in the room, the first patient to walk in the room, the whole room will be orange or red like this. And then when a patient leaves the bed or goes home or dies, this is replaced with a green mat. So now a triage nurse can quickly come in and see which place has been cleaned, and then send the patient right over to the appropriately color-coded covering. And so this is just a quick picture, again, just to show you how crowded these things can be, these facilities can be. And again, these individuals are just covered up and they're just excreting, and there's IV lines that my buddy, former student, color-coded so that you could actually see the IV lines. Because some of the patients require acute or have acute levels of diarrhea excretion, and therefore require IV rehydration as opposed to oral rehydration. So oral rehydration is important, obviously, and as well as IV, but the water has to be pretty safe, not pretty safe, very safe. And so one of the things that will be done is individuals will go around to neighborhoods and villages and so forth and hand out chlorine packets. So if there's an ongoing outbreak, they can instruct them on how to use the chlorine packets to clean their water. The other thing that's done is the community water has to be boiled for that particular emergency hospital and then stored in a container that doesn't come in contact with anything that could cross-contaminate it. There are individuals at the hospital that are employed to prepare oral rehydration solution, and so in this particular case, it's basically just a Gatorade without the fluorescent dyes and all the other garbage we put into our electrolyte type solutions. And so it's just all the basics, glucose, sodium, potassium, chloride, citrate, for example. Mix it up, boil it, and then you can use it for a period of time and discard it, because there's a decent chance that even this woman could be a shedder of cholera, and as a result can contaminate the brew. And this slide just gives you a sense for the types of environments. It's usually pretty, the water that's the lifeblood of their communities in many of these cases is just filthy. And so it's not surprising that cholera can be an endemic like this. And so this is just showing you a cholera hospital design. It's not important that you study this, but just wanted you to see that there's obviously a main area where all the beds would go, and there's a triage nurse or nurses out front, and typically they're deciding whether or not an individual is sick enough to be admitted, or if the patient can just be given chlorine packets and oral rehydration solution and sent home. There's always a guard, because usually these are in very dangerous third world countries, and so people are always trying to come and steal things. And then obviously, you need some supplies and a kitchen and a laundry to clean stuff, and latrines that are outside, especially for families and so forth. This is just showing you some of the staff and these names we just kind of threw them on there. That this guy's name really isn't Clancy, for example, but I wanted you to see this just because these are the tags that these individuals would be wearing at one of these hospitals. And obviously there's an inpatient nurse and an inpatient doctor and a hospital manager that makes sure that everything is stocked and that everybody's getting along, and an epidemiologist that's doing the science of the outbreak, and arguably one of the most important jobs, the health promotion worker that's taking information from the epidemiologist and the doctor and the nurse and basically going out into the community to educate people. So this is a person that's usually well versed in the language and culture of that population to make sure that they're not fully missing the point here, that they are on board, that this is a bacterial infection, for example, and not some voodoo or witchcraft or something that can impede their ability to block the chain of transmission. And then obviously you need somebody on the cleanup crew, the people that are going to clean up. And these are all important jobs. And in fact, the what's not on here, and I should have put that on here, but each of these people's tags say, hello, my name is Hadia, for example, and I am the most important person in this hospital. And each one of their tags will say the same thing. And the reason for that is, you don't want cultural infighting either, because some of these places have caste systems and so forth and look down on others. And so the last thing you want is this doctor making this guy mad, for example, and then this guy saying, well, heck with you, I'm not doing my job. So everything has to work cohesively. A bit of the ecology. So the bacterium can definitely be found in the gut of humans, which is surprising because there are asymptomatic carriers of cholera. And in fact, the 2010 outbreak in Haiti that killed thousands of people following that big earthquake was believed to have been caused by an aid worker who showed up asymptomatically carrying cholera in their gut. And somehow that individual contaminated the water supply. The evidence for that is the genetic match between the outbreak strain of cholera that was isolated from the environment and patients and the presence of the outbreak strain in this asymptomatic Nepalese aid worker. So over here, the bacteria can also be found on crustaceans, the small little crayfish and shrimp and whatever else, and certainly on the blades and vegetative structures of algae. We also find them in fish guts, and they can be free living as well. So here's a representation of that. So here's Vibrio cholerae forming a biofilm, just a slime layer, on a variety of different kinds of phytoplankton. And then there's some planktonic Vibrio, but not very much. When you go out to these places and sample, you don't find very much of it floating around unless there's an active outbreak. The bacteria can also be found in detritus, just sticks and rotting leaves and so forth floating around in these rivers. And they can also be found in zooplankton. And one other place that we find them too is sort of in biofilms in the benthic layer. So again, they're all over the place, and it was a big question mark when in between outbreaks where this bacterium goes. And so that's what the next slide deals with. But that was the big question for a long time: the ecology of cholera. Why do we have massive outbreaks and then they just go away? Once the bacteria are ingested, they can then come in to the host in big slime balls of biofilm, which probably is a way that they can survive your stomach acidity. Or they can swim in as planktonic bacteria that can attach to intestinal epithelium. And then obviously there's lots of shedding of the bacteria in your stool. And so this slide just kind of illustrates the concept that I brought up previously. Where do they go? And so in pre-monsoon season, the bacteria, as I showed you, are in biofilms on biotic and abiotic surfaces in the benthic layer and in the water column. So that's pictured here. So in this particular case, the phytoplankton and zooplankton and detritus in the substrate. During the monsoon season, when you get a lot of wind and rain and the salinity of the environment changes, there's a lot of shear again from the wind and waves and so forth that causes sticks and twigs and all that to start mixing and moving around in the water column. The microbes can shear off. There's also a lot of runoff, from open pit latrines and things like that. So filth from the local villages can run into the water supply as well. During the so this is why during this period here you get the most or the highest levels of cholera in the water, and this is why typically during the monsoon season we see the most most likely to have an outbreak. After the monsoon season, there's an increase in UV irradiation, and again, the part of the reason for that is things settle down. A lot of the cloudiness in the water settles, and UV can penetrate a little bit better and start killing the microbes. You get an algal bloom at that point, and then in turn a zooplankton bloom because they're feeding on the algae, and that gives the bacteria more surfaces to grab onto in this situation where things are getting less hospitable. Again, more UV irradiation can kill the bacteria, but in turn it causes an algal bloom and in turn a zooplankton bloom. So the bacteria now have more surfaces to grab onto, as you see here and here. And so they can then sediment as these zooplankton die. And so they sediment with these plankton and then can feed off of the plankton shells and so forth, the exoskeleton of the plankton, because they can eat chitin. They're really good at eating chitin and some of the nutrients that are present, so they can persist in that state, stuck to chitin and dead things for a long period of time. Here's a copepod, and the cholera would stick to this thing. And then it all starts again. The microbes form the biofilms and kind of hunker down for a while until the rains and everything kick them back up. What's interesting about this is that this whole ecological process led to the discovery that you could use simple filtration methods to remove cholera. Now, obviously, we have more sophisticated filtration methods, but in poor villages and poor countries, you're not going to expect people to have a ready supply of highly expensive 0.2 micron filters lying around. And so one of the mitigation approaches was to have the locals use sari cloths, for example, to filter cholera. And so sari cloths have very big pore sizes. I mean, it's basically like a bandana. And so they have very high pore sizes, but the more you fold them over, the tighter the pores get. And so you can see here these individuals covering the mouths of their collection vases with multiply folded cloths and then collecting their water so that it acts essentially as a strainer. Remember that the cholera concentration has to be really high. So it's not, you don't necessarily have to sterilize your water of cholera. You just have to keep the numbers low, far below that 10 to the 11th, which shouldn't be very hard to do. And so by straining the microbes out using these cloth filters, you can at least make it safe most of the time. And then when they're done with the filtration, they can hang these out to dry and kill the microbes, and then reuse the cloths to filter their next batches of water.